Welcome to week 5 of Intro to Critical Reading. So this week we are covering chapters 5 and 6 from our book. Chapter 5 is entitled, I've Got Way Bigger Problems Than the Spinach Salad Can Solve. And chapter 6 is, this part is about sex. So let's dive right in. Chapter 5, she immediately opens up by talking about coping mechanisms. So coping mechanisms are basically our way of dealing with life, whether that's stress, anxiety, whatever it is. It could be physical pain, it could be mental pain, but how you cope with that is what we're referring to with coping mechanisms. And she talks about how there's this unrealistic expectation put on poor people to not have coping mechanisms such as drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or junk food. And she says it's unrealistic because these people need them even more than your average person or wealthy person. And by normal, I do mean middle class person. And the reason she points out that it is ridiculous for us to put these high expectations on people who are already struggling with so much is that these people are struggling and having to do it with little to no resources. So why would you deny them the few resources they may have to be able to actually help cope with all of those struggles? So she says, we smoke because it's a fast, quick hit of dopamine. We eat junk because it's cheap and it lights up the pleasure centers of our brain. And we do drugs because it's an effective way to feel good or escape something. I get that poor people's coping mechanisms aren't cute. Really, I do. But what I don't get is why other people feel so free in judging us for them, as if our self-destructive behaviors therefore justify and explain our crappy life. Newsflash, it goes both ways. Sometimes the habits are a reaction to the situation. So she is basically equating these symbols of drugs and alcohol that as a society we symbolize as, oh, this is bad, poor choices, bad behavior. And she's using it as a symbol of equality. She says not only do poor people do it, but rich people do it too. It's the judgment that's different. So one way that we see this happening is she talks about that on page 89, chapter 5, where she says, are other people's coping mechanisms better than poor people's because they're prettier? People with more money drink better wine out of nicer glasses, and maybe they get a prescription for benzo from their own personal on-call psychiatrist instead of buying a pack of cigarettes. They can buy whatever they like, and it's okay because retail therapy is a recognized course of treatment for the upper class. Poor people don't have luxuries. So this is a symbol of equality or inequality, depending on how you look at it. We all do them, but the people who are poor are getting judged much more harshly for doing them. And we know this to be true. If we see a person in a nice restaurant, wearing nice clothes, drinking a glass of wine, we don't think a thing about it. But if we see a homeless person on the corner with a paper bag around a 40, then we judge. So she's calling us out on this. And it's ironic, isn't it? Because the people who are poor, here's our irony, they have more reason to be using those than the people who are rich. She also goes into, well, if we're going to start pointing fingers and you think people who are on welfare and getting benefits from the government should never purchase extravagant things, then why aren't we pointing the finger at the rich people who are getting money from the government? And so she's kind of calling out the hypocrisy of large corporations and CEOs and companies getting bailout money from the government, and they're not looked down on it. They talk about record-breaking profits for the year, while at the same time, poor people are judged so harshly. So again, irony. And this can all be found on the bottom of 92-93, where she says, once you take a penny from the government, a morality clause goes into effect, where you're never allowed to have anything that you might actually enjoy. And then she says, I have trouble understanding why taking a few grand a year in food stamps is somehow magically different than taking trillions as a bailout. And then she kind of gives us some sense of feeling towards the characters, these poor characters that we keep reading about, toward the end of the chapter, where she is talking about page 98. The coping that I and many of my friends do via medication isn't just about emotional relief. For me, at least, it's just as much about physical pain management. We're reminded of how hard, physically demanding being a poor person is, and how we judge those people for taking all these different varieties of medications. But as she points out, she has to do this. A lot of poor people have to do this just to be able to function, to be able to wake up, to be able to go to work, to be able to live through that type of pain. So moving on to chapter 6, this part is about sex. This is the chapter where she talks about sex and poverty, and she makes a lot of good points. She talks about how just because people are poor, they're judged for having sex, again, like we just saw in the last chapter, more than people who are rich. Let's look on 106, where she says, for me, sex has been a logical fix for that problem. It doesn't require conversation, no personality necessary, just some skill and willingness, and a partner with the same two things. It's catharsis without any baggage or investment. Sex is kind of magic that way. If you tell a woman she is beautiful and you do it when you are as unguarded as you can possibly be, she will leave you, and it will stick with her. If you tell a man he is wanted and you do it when you are making that very clear, he will remember your words. You can fix people a little bit, plus there are orgasms and cuddling. I couldn't design better therapy. So she's talking about how for people who are already struggling, and these people tend to have more problems with mental health, such as depression and anxiety, and they're stressed, right? And they're stressed mentally and physically. Sex is actually a very therapeutic thing for them. And body. She goes on to talk about wealthier people. This is the bottom of 107. Wealthier people don't seem to understand it when some poor person pairs up with some other poor person who maybe isn't so perfect, maybe doesn't have the greatest teeth or the most steady employment or the best attitude about the world. They seem to think that for every Julia Roberts, there's a Richard Gere just waiting to catapult her into respectability. Here she talks about the convenience of sex a lot of times, how in poor communities we often see it as a bartering. It's not so much as prostitution as it is, well, I'd like to have sex with you anyway, and you have an apartment and I don't, so I'll just live here and we can have sex. She talks about how times people who are struggling financially, especially women, will use their body to actually help them gain jobs or gain money at their jobs. She says the act of putting on a corset on page 110 is enough to negate any dental problems, weight issues, personality flaws. Guys would just see that 3 inches were a very specific kind of fat folds together and boom, instant idiots. And she says, I like this last section, so I'm going to go ahead and read it all from 111 to 112. It's ridiculous to suggest that poor people should behave more appropriately about sexual matters than anyone else does. I am fairly certain I could walk into any swanky bar and find well-off people who are hoping for a night's fling. I can say with near certainty that most high-end sex clubs cater to wealthy patrons. I like to remind people that everyone's parents fucked. Sex isn't dirty, isn't abnormal, shouldn't be a source of shame. Sadly, we as a society are a bit more conflicted about it than that. And for some reason, we moralize more at the poor about sex than we do at the population in general. Living in low-income neighborhoods, I've seen sexual health campaigns aimed at slut-shaming us into celibacy. They talk about things like self-esteem and value and all the usual abstinence arguments. They assume that our bodies are a gift that we should bestow selectively on others, rather than the one thing that can never be anything but our own. It is ours irrevocably. These are the bodies that hold the brains we're supposed to shut off all day at work, the same bodies that aren't important enough to heal. These are the bodies that come with the genitalia that we should be so protective of. I really don't understand the logic. You can't tell us that our brains and labor and emotions are worth next to nothing and then expect us to get all full of intrinsic worth when it comes to our genitals. Either we're cheap or we're not. Make up your fucking mind. And that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? A lot of times people want to act as if poor people shouldn't get to have any fun, whether that's drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever. They shouldn't use any coping mechanisms to help them deal with the strifes of life. They should just suffer through it. And it's almost like that's their punishment for being poor. And we've seen it, and we may have even been a part of it. But the problem with that is that these are people. These aren't just statistics and numbers. These are actual real people who, if you ask yourself, if I had to deal with what they're dealing with, would I be doing it with as much grace as they are? So, Linda Tirado is, again, opening our eyes and making us realize that those with coping mechanisms, whether they're rich or poor, should be judged the same. And if you wouldn't judge a person in a bar with a glass of wine, then you probably shouldn't judge that homeless person with the beer in a paper sack. Because guess what? They're both doing the same thing. They're just trying to cope with whatever it is that day. So we saw some symbolism. We saw some irony. We connected with characters. And characters, again, those are just the people depicted in the story. But we're also starting to recognize themes that are going on. Some themes that she's hitting on is the inequality between the rich and the poor. And also coping mechanisms and how those are used to help people deal, how there's a fine line between using coping mechanisms to get through the day to ending up needing those coping mechanisms, and where's the balance? Does one start first, meaning you need the coping mechanisms to get through the day, and then you end up getting through the day just so you can have the coping mechanisms, or is it vice versa? So she's bringing up a lot of good points here. Make sure for next week that you read on to chapters 7 and 8, and have a good day.